Elliot Jensen had always considered himself an ordinary man, which in his case meant slightly clumsy, perpetually overcaffeinated, and perpetually startled by things that beeped louder than a polite toaster. That Tuesday, however, his life leapt straight out of ordinary and into chaos with a polite, yet distinctly otherworldly, knock on the reinforced lab door of the Earth Global Security Bureau. He was hunched over a stack of reports no one would ever read, muttering about how human error was the real global threat, when the door shimmered like oil on water and a figure stepped through it without hesitation. She looked human enough, if humans occasionally had the elegance of a concert pianist and the audacity of a circus acrobat. Long, supple ears extended from her head in graceful arcs, twitching and rotating independently as if they had their own nervous system, and possibly a vendetta against bad music. Her eyes were a shade of violet that suggested she either drank too much interstellar coffee or had genuinely never experienced dullness. She tilted her head politely, and Elliot, momentarily forgetting to breathe, managed, "Hi. I am Saria," she said, her voice a melody that could make a metronome rethink its life choices. "I come with urgent information regarding," she paused dramatically, "your planet's imminent destabilization due to a cosmic resonance." Elliot blinked. The cat in the lab hissed at the shimmering door frame. "Cosmic, what now?" he asked, hoping to sound casual but failing spectacularly. Saria's lips twitched in something suspiciously like amusement. "The universe is sending a very firm reminder that Earth may not survive the week. But don't worry, I have solutions. Mostly." Elliot nodded. Mostly. That sounded reassuring. He poured her a cup of coffee because, apparently, this was how Earthlings handled existential crises. When she asked if he had quantum foam creamer, he considered fainting in disbelief. He'd read about alien invasions, but never in a cafeteria menu context. The lab descended into a mixture of screaming alarms and panicked colleagues. One scientist suggested containment, another suggested incineration, and one very bold intern suggested they all run and scream outside. Elliot, holding his coffee like a shield, said, maybe we should listen to her first?" The suggestion hung awkwardly in the air, a beacon of reason in a storm of absurdity. Saria inclined her head, ears flicking with satisfaction. "Yes, listening is a good start," she said, "although I do appreciate the melodramatic chaos you humans generate." They moved to a holographic map of the planet, her fingers leaving trails of glowing light as she explained the patterns of the resonance. Elliot squinted, trying to understand whether he was watching science or some kind of cosmic light show. Every few seconds, Saria's ears twitched in directions he didn't understand, giving her expressions an almost comic timing. "So, we're doomed if we do nothing?" he asked, trying to keep his humor intact in the face of literal planetary collapse. "Not doomed," she corrected, one corner of her mouth curving upwards like a mischievous star. "Merely inconvenienced, and possibly, if you're very good at following instructions, mildly heroic." Elliot couldn't resist. Mildly heroic sounds manageable. "Do I get a cape?" Saria's ears twitched as though to say, "You might want one." In that lab, amidst blinking panels, floating test tubes, and a cat now wearing what appeared to be a gravity belt, Elliot realized that fear was pointless when faced with the extraordinary. It was easier, funnier, even to trust Saria, to follow this absurd, elegant, ear-twitching alien woman who had just stepped into his life, and perhaps into the fate of the entire planet. And for reasons he could not explain, he felt a flicker of excitement. If the universe intended to be weird, Elliot decided, he might as well meet it with coffee in hand and jokes at the ready. Elliot quickly discovered that working with Saria was nothing like his previous emergencies, which usually involved spilled coffee or accidentally deleting someone's spreadsheet. This was cosmic-level chaos, and somehow, she made it feel like an elaborate science fiction improv show. She had an array of devices that hummed, clicked, and occasionally floated above the work table as if they were sentient, and in one memorable instance, the toaster began levitating, forcing Elliot to duck under it while muttering, "Not the breakfast rebellion again." Saria had a way of explaining the universe that was simultaneously brilliant and absurd. She used holographic projections of wormholes and resonance patterns, letting them swirl in midair. And then she would point with her elongated fingers to something Elliot assumed was important. "Here," she said, ears twitching, is the focal point of Earth's destabilization. Notice the minor fluctuation in graviton density. Elliot squinted, saw a shimmering blue cloud that resembled a cosmic jellyfish, and said, yeah. Totally, I see it, jellyfish. Saria tilted her head, and he could swear one ear flicked like a question mark. Jellyfish is acceptable, she said, for a human approximation. Every plan she suggested carried a small element of peril, and Elliot, trying to be helpful, suggested small safety measures: helmets, gloves, reinforced lab coats. But Saria waved him off with a flick of her hand that made several devices spin gently in the air. I admire your caution, she said, but fear has minimal utility here. Humor, on the other hand, is surprisingly stabilizing for quantum fields. Who knew? Elliot, floating momentarily due to a microgravity pulse she had accidentally triggered, tried to joke, I guess my dignity doesn't stabilize anything. She flicked her ears in something approximating amusement, and Elliot nearly choked on laughter midair. In between calculations and floating mishaps, Elliot noticed small, charming oddities about Saria. She sneezed in a way that momentarily reversed gravity for objects within a 3-meter radius, and she occasionally hummed in harmonic frequencies that made the lab's fluorescent lights pulse like a disco. She had a curious fondness for human snacks, insisting that chocolate had unexpected molecular resilience, and that donuts were worthy of observation in the context of circular symmetry and caloric delight. Elliot tried to teach her about coffee again, which resulted in a brief but spectacular foam explosion that left him sticky and laughing, while she merely tilted her head, ears quivering, as if the mess were part of some performance art. Despite the chaos, Elliot began to understand her methods. The resonance wasn't just destructive, it was rhythmic, like a cosmic heartbeat that responded to patterns of sound, light, and, strangely, laughter. Saria's approach was both scientific and playful. She manipulated localized gravity fields to induce oscillations that corrected the resonance, while Elliot's contributions involved bad jokes, coffee refills, and occasional human intuition that somehow worked in sync with her alien calculations. You humans are messy, unpredictable, and occasionally brilliant, she said, adjusting a holographic projection with a graceful flick of her hand. I may have underestimated your comedic input. By the 4th day, Elliot found that the fear he had felt when she first arrived had dissolved into something far more productive: camaraderie. They argued over whether graviton fluxes should be approached linearly or with a bit of improvisation. She mocked his terrible puns, and he, in turn, learned to anticipate her ear twitches as cues for critical adjustments in her calculations. Together, they discovered a pattern, a resonance lull that lasted precisely 27 minutes, during which they could test the stabilizing devices without catastrophic side effects. During one of these lulls, Elliot tried to float a stapler using one of her microgravity fields. It hovered for 2 seconds before plummeting into his forehead. Saria blinked, ears quivering like little flags, and muttered, "It's working mostly." The days passed in a rhythm of chaos and discovery. Elliot realized that the world outside might be teetering on the edge of a cosmic meltdown, but inside that lab, humor and science collided in a way that made the impossible feel oddly manageable. With every floating mug, every quantum foam spill, and every perfectly timed joke, Elliot's fear continued to shrink. The alien woman with the twitching ears had become not just a guide through the chaos, but an anchor in it, a reminder that survival might depend less on rigid protocol and more on trust, intuition, and a shared willingness to laugh at the universe's absurdity. Elliot had never imagined that saving the world would involve so much floating, so many quantum equations scribbled midair, and so many opportunities to get hit by an errant coffee mug. Yet here he was, standing in the center of the lab-turned chaos hub, surrounded by Saria's hovering devices, glowing holographic grids, and a general hum of resonating energy that made even the fluorescent lights seem nervous. The cosmic resonance had surged to levels that made the lab walls shimmer like heat waves above a desert. And for the first time in days, Elliot felt the familiar gnaw of fear. Then he glanced at Saria, whose long ears twitched in anticipation, and remembered how far he had come. Fear, it turned out, was less useful than quick thinking, coffee, and a well-timed joke. "All right," Saria said, voice calm yet teasing, "this is it. The resonance peak will pass through the planet in 5 cycles. My plan is simple. I synchronize my neural frequencies with Earth's magnetic grid. It's dangerous, but statistically, well, let's not dwell on statistics. Mostly, you just need to follow instructions and keep the instrument stable. Elliot's stomach did a slow somersault. Follow instructions felt vague, but experience had taught him that vague with Saria often meant miraculously effective. He nodded. Got it. Mostly alive, right? She tilted her head, ears flicking. Mostly alive is excellent. As the first pulse of resonance hit, the lab shivered, test tubes floating, alarms buzzing in theatrical protest. Elliot's first task was to calibrate a device he didn't understand. The instructions were minimal. Twist it gently, then hold it like you love it. He muttered, I'm very affectionate, mostly with coffee, and turned the dial. Saria hovered beside him, emanating a soft violet glow that pulsed with the rhythm of the planet's magnetic field. Her presence was calming, and in a way, absurdly reassuring, like a cosmic safety net stitched from light and sarcasm. The second pulse hit, stronger this time, and Elliot had to dodge a levitating stapler that twirled toward him like a baton in a very wrong parade. He laughed midair, shouting, maybe we should have worn helmets. Saria chuckled, a sound that made her ears flutter in perfect comedic timing, and for a moment, the laboratory felt more like a chaotic carnival than a center of planetary salvation. Despite the chaos, each pulse allowed Saria to channel energy into the grid, gradually stabilizing the resonance. Elliot's part was to keep the instruments humming and occasionally apply what he referred to as human improvisational genius. By the 4th cycle, the resonance had reached its peak, and Elliot noticed a subtle shift in himself. The man who had been terrified of his own shadow just days ago was now moving with purpose, juggling instructions, levitating objects, and cracking jokes to ease both Saria's tension and his own. He felt a strange pride, not just in surviving, but in trusting something or someone beyond his understanding. Okay, floating coffee mug number 12, he muttered. Let's make it count. The 5th pulse was critical. Saria's neural frequency intertwined with the magnetic grid, creating a shimmering lattice of energy that spread outward, neutralizing the destructive resonance. The lab erupted in a display of violet and blue light, with gravity gently returning to normal, cups landing mostly upright, and instruments spinning back into place. Elliot stumbled, catching himself on a console, and she reached out a hand. We did it, she said, ear flicks betraying her amusement at his ungraceful landing. The world outside was safe, the cosmic resonance dissipated, and Elliot realized how profoundly he had changed. He had learned that fear was negotiable, that trust could be a superpower, and that humor, absurd, well-timed human humor, could anchor even the most alien of circumstances. Saria looked at him, tilted her head, and said, humans are peculiar, but I can see why this one survived. Elliot grinned, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the laboratory lights. And aliens with long ears are weirdly reassuring, he replied, earning a soft laugh that sent a ripple through the instruments. When the dust and holographic sparkles settled, Elliot knew the world would go on, oblivious to how narrowly it had been spared. He had found courage, friendship, and the odd joy of laughing in the face of planetary catastrophe. As Saria prepared to leave, ears flicking like farewell banners, Elliot realized he didn't feel afraid anymore. Not of the universe, not of the unknown. He felt ready. And if the universe wanted to throw its next absurd challenge at him, he would face it, with a coffee in hand, a joke on his lips, and an alien ally who had become, improbably, his only hope. The aftermath of the resonance had left the lab in a state of organized chaos. Gravity still wobbled occasionally, test tubes hovered like confused hummingbirds, and Elliot found himself brushing chocolate foam off his sleeve, again. Saria stood in the center of the room, ears twitching in amusement at the lingering oscillations, and Elliot realized that this was the quiet before the final act. The planet was safe, yes, but the job was not yet complete. The energy Saria had channeled into the magnetic grid needed fine-tuning, and Elliot had learned the hard way that cosmic stabilization was never straightforward. Okay, Saria said, floating above the console with a grace that made Elliot's attempts at posture look like interpretive dance. We need to harmonize the secondary flux. Think of it as tuning a violin, except the violin is the earth, the strings are invisible, and the bow is quantum energy that might roast you if misused. Elliot swallowed. He had never been good at instruments. Mostly, he had been good at spilling coffee, avoiding responsibility, and sarcastic commentary. Somehow, that seemed like the exact skill set required here. The instruments hummed in response to their movements. Elliot followed Seria's precise gestures, twisting dials, tapping holographic sliders, and occasionally waving his arms in what he hoped looked like intentional adjustments rather than panicked flailing. Each pulse of the secondary flux created shimmering waves across the lab, and every time Elliot managed not to send the floating staplers crashing into the ceiling, he allowed himself a small, triumphant grin. Seria's ears twitched, and Elliot began to interpret these subtle movements as a combination of approval and amusement. "I'm pretty sure I just invented a new form of human-alien communication," he said, dodging a bouncing instrument like it was a cosmic pinball. Hours, or what felt like hours, though gravity kept messing with his perception of time, passed as they worked together. Elliot noticed the subtle ways he had changed. He anticipated Seria's calculations, suggested minor adjustments that actually helped, and learned to embrace uncertainty with humor rather than fear. When a floating monitor nearly collided with his head, he ducked with a joke ready. "Incoming, hope it likes coffee." Seria laughed, and for the first time he felt that laughter had power beyond amusement. It had resonance. Finally, the secondary flux harmonized. The instruments settled, gravity normalized, and the lab became a calm, slightly glowing sanctuary. Elliot leaned against a console, exhausted but exhilarated. "We did it," he said, almost in disbelief. Seria floated closer, ears quivering like delicate banners. "Indeed, Earth is now stable, thanks to a human who can make terrible jokes while simultaneously saving a planet. Remarkable." Elliot laughed, realizing that he had genuinely earned that praise. The subplots, the hovering instruments, the floating coffee mugs, the lab cat wearing a tiny gravity belt, all found their resolution. The resonance had passed. Humanity remained obliviously intact, yet the experience had left Elliot profoundly changed. He no longer feared the unknown in the same way. He had discovered courage, ingenuity, and a rare form of trust that transcended species. More than that, he had learned that humor could coexist with the gravest of crises, that absurdity could anchor focus, and that collaboration, even with someone whose ears could rotate independently, could achieve the impossible. As Seria prepared to leave through the shimmering portal, she turned to Elliot. "You have potential," she said, one ear flicking thoughtfully. "Not just for survival, but for leadership, creativity, and apparently comedy. Humans are messy, yes, but occasionally brilliant. I will not forget this." Elliot nodded, feeling a surge of pride and something warmer, a connection that went beyond fear, beyond duty, beyond even laughter. "I won't forget either," he said, "and if the universe decides to mess with us again, we'll be ready." The portal shimmered, then closed. Elliot stood alone in the quiet lab, instruments humming softly like a satisfied heartbeat. He looked out at the sky, feeling a calm that had nothing to do with gravity, everything to do with growth. He had faced the unknown, trusted the improbable, and found strength he didn't know he possessed. For the first time, Elliot understood that the universe was vast, strange, and occasionally hilarious, and that he, armed with courage, humor, and a memory of an alien woman with twitching ears, could meet it head-on.